Thank you all so much for joining us this afternoon for a special edition of our Future of Entertainment series with John Stankey, the Chief Executive Officer of AT&T. I'm very excited to have this conversation, particularly right now in the context of the recent successes of Godzilla vs. Kong and Mortal Kombat, both on HBO Max and at the box office. If you'd like to ask questions throughout this conversation, please just type them up in the Q&A box below. And at some point in about a half an hour or so, we'll open it up for audience questions. I also just wanted to say that we are recording this for future use, both by AT&T and the USC School of Cinematic Arts. So just be aware that we may ask a question and it may wind up in the recording. But please welcome Elizabeth Daly, the Dean of the USC School of Cinematic Arts, who will say a few words of introduction about John.
Thank you so much, Alex. Hello, everyone. This is quite a remarkable event for us. And I am Elizabeth Daly, I'm the Dean here, and it's just such a great pleasure to welcome John Stankey to the School of Cinematic Arts today. John assumed the role of CEO of AT&T in July 2020. After serving as the company's president and chief operating officer. He therefore oversees one of the world's leading communications companies with interest in mobile, broadband, and of course, an array of storytelling outlets under the WarnerMedia umbrella. His work is critically important to our work, and I'm very glad that he's agreed to let us see his view of the future today. You know, the USC School of Cinematic Arts has a very, very long history with Warner Brothers, actually dating back to Jack Warner himself. So, John, it's a particular pleasure for me to be able to welcome you to the USC School of Cinematic Arts family, and I just hope there are going to be many more times to do so. So, Alex, let's get on with the conversation.
Thank you so much. And John, thank you and welcome.
It's good to be here, and I appreciate you having me, and I have to tell a brief anecdote. I think the first day I came into the job running WarnerMedia back in 2017, I walked into my office in New York, and sitting on the desk was a note from Elizabeth with a nice book about the USC Cinematic School of the Arts to introduce me to it and remind me of the longstanding relationship. So I got indoctrinated very quickly as I moved into the role.
Well, I'm sure we have an updated version of that book we can send your way. So I thought we would get started by talking a little bit about your career in telecommunications before AT&T acquired Time Warner, which became WarnerMedia. Can you talk a bit about your journey from being a leader in telecom to being a leader in media and entertainment to now being a CEO that has to oversee both? Tell us a little bit about how you first got involved in AT&T leading up to the Time Warner acquisition.
Well, it's a really complex question, Alex, and it's one that probably should form the basis of a book at some point that I'll never write. So there's so many different angles we could take on it. But look, I think if I were to go back fairly early in my career, I can remember probably sometime in the mid 80s, maybe late 80s, 89. There was a discussion at the point in time where professional services firms like consulting firms were now starting to consolidate their practices of telecom and media and bring them together. And the notion was, well, these two industries are going to start working more closely together at that time based on things that were happening in the environment, regulation changes, business model changes. And that may have been a little bit premature, but I do believe we're at this point right now where it doesn't matter whether you're in the media industry or the telecom industry or financial services or retail or automobile manufacturing. Virtually every industry is now going through a vertical integration dynamic. And the reality of that vertical integration is it's bringing different parts of the supply chain together that used to be independent. And telecom was frequently a distribution vehicle for entertainment or for media. And as you know, the media industries, typically the legacy media companies were.
Oh, I lost your audio there for a second. Sorry, one second. Can someone I can't hear you, John. I don't know if that's something that just happened on my end or. I'm just trying muting now. Okay, there we go.
Try it again.
Yeah, you're good.
Okay. So I'm not sure when you lost me, but telecom for a long period of time was distributing, and media was largely a wholesale business. They would build a piece of content and then sell it to anybody who could distribute it, and typically didn't have awareness or knowledge of who was actually consuming that great piece of content they created. And Netflix effectively started to change that game, right? Where not only did they create the content, but they knew exactly what the end user was enjoying, when they were enjoying it, what they wanted to do. And so that same dynamic is going on in literally every industry. And it's natural that when you start to see that integration, people are going to come at it from one end or the other. Either you're going to come at it from a legacy media space and learn more about distribution, or you're going to come at it from a technology and distribution space and learn more about content. And I think anytime you run a big team, you end up having to bring together skills and capabilities from a variety of disciplines, no matter what job you're in. And in this case, I came with a little bit of distribution expertise, a little bit of technology expertise, and started working with teams that were really good at creating great content that could go on distribution platforms, and that we could start to learn more about that end user, what they were watching, what they wanted to watch, and how to put it out more effectively in front of the user base, where you had a vertically integrated product. And that's the dynamic that's going on in the industry right now.
I don't want to go too far down that road before talking about Time Warner, but is there any particular example that you have of something that you've learned because of this that has affected a creative choice?
I wouldn't say as much on a creative choice side, but I think one of the things that you always have to look at when you start to bring and merge industries, or frankly any businesses together, is the cultural dynamics of the business, what the incentive structures are that are in place, how do people define success and think about their role within the company. And that particular dynamic is one that has changed pretty significantly between telecom and media. And I would say learning how to kind of normalize that and get to a place where neither one nor the other dominates, but there's a new approach and a new breed to how things get done, how people are motivated, how organizations work together, has been probably one of the more challenging and difficult aspects of this journey.
So what was particularly attractive about Time Warner at that time? Like where did you, I mean, was it obvious to you that this was the company you wanted to acquire? What were some of the main factors that led to that decision?
Anytime you get into a decision to do something inorganically, there's always trade-offs and a bit of an optimization equation. And media is an interesting place because so many of the companies that operate in the media space and have been around for a while have maybe atypical structures. They have controlling families or super voting shares or a variety of other things that don't make it as straightforward a transaction as you might see in other industries. Time Warner was a bit unique in that it really didn't have those characteristics. It was largely a publicly traded company without any family control. And, frankly, Jeff Bewkes, the CEO of Time Warner at the time we acquired it, had spent most of his tenure thinking about where the industry was going to go, and very smartly understood that ultimately there was going to be some pretty substantial changes in media, that it was ultimately going to be a very scaled business, where having assets and scale and the ability to do what I talked about earlier, which is distribute directly to the consumer, was ultimately going to be important. And he made a lot of deliberate decisions to put Time Warner in a position to ultimately be a great, high quality set of assets that could be consolidated into another business and effectively help that transition. And so I think Jeff knew he was going to need a partner in some way, shape, or form, either another media company to get the right kind of scale, or somebody who had distribution clout that could help him through with first party data and customer relationships like an AT&T. And so the business was really set up to do something like this, whereas, many of the companies had controlling interests and people who want to maintain supermajority voting constructs, and that complicates M&A a little bit, makes it a little bit harder. Or there's a family legacy where somebody doesn't want to trade on an asset that's been in the family for a long time, or has unreasonable expectations around what that deal should look like. That, coupled with the fact that the Time Warner assets were just really high quality assets. The Warner Brothers studio, as Elizabeth mentioned at the front end, is a very, very unique property with a long storied history and great capabilities. HBO, of course, another company that has managed to remake itself every decade for the last 30 or 40 years, with a great history. And then, the Turner assets have, clearly unique characteristics of ability to operate in news and sports and do creative things that others didn't. So high quality set of assets coupled with that kind of made it a natural.
I'm curious, when you started to move towards the creation of HBO Max, knowing that you were going to have access to the Warner Brother library, to other, all of the programming across the Turner networks, that, WarnerMedia was going to offer an enormous amount of high quality content, but you were going to focus the branding through HBO. Obviously, for people who love television like myself, HBO is the gold standard. So that to me becomes very obvious, but it's not necessarily, I think, a given that access to the Warner library would go through a platform called HBO. So tell us a little bit about that decision, how you decided to brand it that way.
Yeah, that was one of those classic jump ball decisions I think you get to in business frequently. And the team did a tremendous amount of work, as you might expect, primary customer research, brand strength research, tested a lot of different things, focus groups, to ascertain what would be the right branding of a platform. Think about it as an umbrella brand, really, because we felt that these platforms that ultimately get into customer households will at some point want to have sub-brands that operate underneath them, that in fact will be a point of view of strength. So we never thought this would only be a single brand on the platform. In fact, maybe in a mature state, once you scale a platform where you can get into many hundreds of millions of households, there may still be independent creators that come in with their own brands that want to live on that platform and survive. And we want to be prepared for that day when that occurs. So we looked at, is the Warner Brothers name the best name to go after? Was it HBO? Should it be some derivative of HBO? And frankly, tested a variety of names that weren't even in the market right now, and some other brand names that we own. And the decision was that, nothing was particularly a home run. Warner Brothers actually wasn't as strong as HBO or HBO Max. HBO Max wasn't as strong as Netflix. So we knew no matter what we did, we were going to have to invest time and energy at defining and positioning the brand. And all I will tell you is, from my past experience in other parts of my business life, one of the things I've learned about branding is time and money fixes everything. So, as long as you're willing to invest and spend the time and the energy on something, you can get a brand to where you need it to get. Mm-hmm. And HBO Max was strong, but it wasn't a knockout, clear-cut first choice. And we also had a dynamic that we had to balance, where we had, 36 million HBO subscribers, and we wanted to bring them with us on the journey. That in some respects, that was a great head start, right? We got to start this with 36 million people who liked HBO, and we felt like if we could do HBO and then some, it should be right that they carried on in that journey. And we knew HBO Max needed to have a broader aperture than HBO. It's a brand that does incredibly well on the West Coast and the East Coast, not as strong in the central part of the US. The Max part of HBO was designed to open that aperture, broaden the customer base that might be interested in other types of content that didn't live under the HBO brand. So we wanted to preserve HBO, but extend it with HBO Max and really have our lunch and, eat it too kind of thing, right?
When it first launched, I, as a HBO subscriber, specifically to HBO Now, was sort of confused. Like, how is this going to be different as an app, as opposed to, I mean, I understood the addition of the catalog and that sort of thing, but how was this going to be different? And then it just sort of got solved for me. I woke up one day and my HBO Now widget had turned into HBO Max, and all of a sudden I had everything, and I've been thrilled ever since. But for the people that are potentially coming at this not having any services, how important was original programming to launching it? Because I remember, last year we saw stuff like The Flight Attendant, which was excellent, and now we're seeing a lot of movies. But what was the key element for attracting people to actually subscribe to the service?
You just kind of made the point of time and money cures a lot of things on branding, right? Where you may have been confused, and that was, I think, whipped into a big story early on, and now it's kind of like people are past the dynamic of what is HBO Max. So it's another one of those streaming services I should think about, right? And as we get rid of the reality that we had to move 36 million subscribers from one product to the other, as that transition occurs, it starts to carry away. In most streaming services, I don't think this is any different for Netflix, or it will be no different for Disney Plus or others, but typically to sustain the business, you need original content to grow and build the funnel. And you need a library to keep customers with the service and avoid churn. And so every service has its own profile of strengths and weaknesses. To your earlier point, Alex, we started with a library of over 40,000 hours of really high rate content, of which we took a portion of that, brought it in, that formed the nucleus of HBO Max. But we had to really kind of start from, a standing stop to build new content. And, the unfortunate thing is we didn't plan on a pandemic. And so we were in the middle of a lot of production, getting ready to finish a lot of shows and launch HBO Max in March. And then lo and behold, the pandemic hit, and we had a whole bunch of things that we had planned that just got stopped, 2 episodes into production, 3 episodes into production, and had to wait a year before we could get restarted, or 9 months before we could get restarted. And it created a little bit of a problem in our planning and in the calendar of how we had planned to introduce new content to keep the funnel alive. And so that brought us to a decision that said, look, while we're waiting to get restarted from COVID and finish these great series that we'd been working on that weren't done, did we have another strategy? And we did have a bunch of theatrical movies that we had finished, and they were all sitting in the can waiting, and nobody could go to theaters. And so, that became the genesis of kind of the decision around maybe that's better used to not only sustain the theater business during a time when nobody seemed to want to go to theaters because it wasn't much to choose from, but also bolster the streaming service. And could we kill 2 birds with 1 stone? The other calculus around that was pretty straightforward. One is, believe it or not, you can't keep a movie on the shelf forever and still have it be relevant. They do age, and the longer you let something age, the less relevant it becomes. And then in addition, there's a huge air traffic control problem in the industry. Everybody was holding their best movies, right? Nobody wanted to pass on the possibility that they could be releasing the next 750 million or $1 billion theatrical release. So if you had Bond, you held on to it and said, I'm going to wait for the pandemic to be over to make sure I get the most out of the theatrical window. Well, that's fine. But if every studio is doing that, and then suddenly the pandemic ends and all these great high quality films hit the theater all at once, I don't think it's realistic to assume that somehow after the pandemic, the movie going public is going to double in size. It's probably going to look about, best case scenario, the same size it was before the pandemic. Likely case scenario, maybe a little smaller. And now you've got all these top rated films vying for the same size audience all at the same time. And we just didn't think that was going to be a good place to be, and that economically it would be better to give theater owners something to put in the theater now,
Right.
and at the same time help grow subscription on the SVOD service and kind of get it out of its adolescence and into adulthood. And I think that strategy has worked out pretty well.
Though you did, I mean, I should really thank you, because the decision to put Tenet in theaters even predates all of the HBO Max, announcements and stuff. And I remember driving to Poway, California, in San Diego County, to be able to go see a movie at an AMC on opening weekend. I mean, it was an amazing moment. Sadly, obviously, didn't last throughout the end of the year. But what was that decision like, on your end, to actually put this out in theaters, knowing that it wasn't also going to have its VOD version?
Well, so, in this case, as you do with many projects around here, you work with the partners and the creative energy behind something. And Christopher Nolan, as you know, has very high expectations of himself and does some amazing work. And, he felt pretty strongly that what he'd worked on so hard, to my earlier point, had a shelf life, and that the story needed to get out and be told. And the longer we waited to do that, the more risk he was taking at the story being received well. And so he had a strong desire to get the movie released. We all were trying to figure our way through a very, undefined time. I mean, none of us knew what was going to occur. And if you recall, back in that time frame, infection rates had started to drop, things were getting a little bit better. And the question was, could we find a window? And Christopher was highly motivated to get the movie out and get it in front of people. And having a long-standing relationship with him, we worked hard to try to come up with a strategy that we thought would work. And we gave it our best go. We committed money to marketing it and put it in as many theaters as we possibly could, given restrictions that were in place. And it was a great movie. Unfortunately, because of the circumstances around it, it was a little bit hard for people to summon up their desire to want to go into a theater and watch it, and probably didn't do quite as well as it should have or could have in a normal time in the box office. And we learned a lot from that. And I think that partly informed when we made the broader decision on the slate, on the co-release on HBO Max and in theaters, as to why we felt it was the right decision, because we just didn't see a theatrical only launch as kind of being appropriate for the time of year that we were in early this year and how long that was likely to last. And so it was a good learning experience. I was pleased that he partnered with us and worked with us to try to test it out, but that learning helped inform some of the other decisions that were made for the balance of 2021.
Well, let's talk about those, because in December there was this announcement of this hybrid model with a theatrical release and an exclusive concurrent 1-month streaming access period on HBO Max. I personally have gone to the theater for both Godzilla vs. Kong and for Mortal Kombat. And I know it's sort of ironic that, there was a lot of pushback from exhibitors when that decision was made, and yet these are the films that are actually making exhibition profitable in this moment in the pandemic. So it's sort of been very interesting to see how it plays out. Can you tell us a little bit about the specificity of the decision, like saying 1 month and then taking it off and let it play out in theaters? I mean, I think Wonder Woman was also followed this model, right?
Mm-hmm. So look, when we announced it, I think one of the things that's important for everybody to realize, usually when we get into a media cycle on something, my rule of thumb is it's never as bad as it sounds and it's never as good as it sounds. There's always a little bit of a swing to one extreme or the other than the reality of the circumstances. And I think we believe pretty strongly that given the circumstances of 21, trying something that was a little bit different was actually going to be a win-win across the board. And you've identified one of the wins, which was the thing that a theater owner needed more than anything else was some certainty that each month they were going to get a product to actually put in a cinema so that they could bring people back to work on a routine basis and, know that they're going to have a screen that's open and open up the concession stand and all the things that they need to do for consistency. Similarly, to get the benefit out of doing something for a streaming subscription service where somebody makes a commitment to pay you every month, you needed to market a slate. You needed to market something that had promise for more than, one showing. And we were able to do that by defining a full year's worth of releases. And I think what we're seeing is, there is the rising tide lifts all boats dynamic. There are people who are passionate about seeing certain theatrical movies in a cinema, and they're going to do it. I mean, if I had my choice, I would go see In the Heights in a theater. You're going to miss something, not seeing that movie on a big screen in a high quality venue, and you should do that. But there are some that will not, but they will become exposed to something they wouldn't see otherwise because they have a choice now to see it in a different venue. And I think the reality is we kind of have to think about this from, we do have tastes that are changing. We have generational differences that are occurring, and we need to cater ultimately to customer needs to be successful. And I do think there are middle grounds on these things. And do I think that, Warner Brothers is going to produce 20 cinema-worthy theatrical releases a year as we maybe did 3 or 4 years ago? Probably not. But are we going to do 8 or 10 really high quality theatrical experiences that are going to be differentially better in a theater than they are at home? We should, and we should even get better doing it so that people are more incented to go. And that may be the model of the future, frankly.
Well, I could not agree with you more about In the Heights. We are talking to John Chu about what can we possibly do in person for this film. So fingers crossed.
Wonderful movie. Everybody should go see it. I wish, but there was an example. I actually had an exchange with John on the movie, which, in the height of the pandemic and all the things that were going on in society and some of the vitriol that was being exchanged on issues of race, and it would have been such a wonderful movie to release at that point in time with such a poignant and important message of culture and people and getting along with one another, and an uplifting story and family and support. Wouldn't it have been great if it could have shown up in everybody's home at a time when we needed that message? But it is definitely one that will be differential on a big screen, and I think people will thoroughly enjoy it.
Well, I guess I wanted to ask a little bit about how the decision to put stuff day and date streaming as well as in theaters affects the way in which your relationship to the film production team works in terms of compensation and the way that profit participation has happened in the past versus what it may look like in the future. What really is a sort of success story here between theatrical revenue and streaming revenue for WarnerMedia, for AT&T?
Yeah, I think it's actually what is the relationship for the creative who is involved in making the content, and some of the emotion or the noise, if you want to call it that, at the moment in time, it really, to your point, gets down to how do I make money? And there's nothing bad about that. I think that's probably been a motivating force for decades, and it's certainly a motivating force in virtually any industry. But when something suddenly changes and the rules change, people, anxiety goes up, right? Emotion gets higher. But the way I think about it, I can be really clinical about it. We went through a pandemic. People who worked in the airline industry woke up one day and all of a sudden nobody was flying airplanes and people weren't making money. People who went to hotels and restaurants woke up one day and nobody was going to a hotel or restaurant, and people weren't making money or they were unemployed, and people stopped going to theaters and there was no money to be made. And there are going to be collateral issues that fall out of that, and things are going to change. And I think the reality is that decision was just nothing more than that point in time of, oh, the rules are going to change what's going to happen. And once everybody figured out, what the new ground rules were and how they were going to get money for their efforts, I think everybody kind of settled down. And as a result of that, our agents and does talent now think about that in any contract they get involved in, and trying to make sure that there's a balance of ensuring they get paid fairly for the work they do, which is something that I think Warner Brothers has always had a great reputation of doing. And I think we came out in a place in this situation where folks feel like they were treated fairly. Took us a little bit of time to get there, but when you have that many titles being released and that many participants, it does take a little bit of time to work through those things. I think we'll just find that new model going forward. No different than when people bought out the back end rights and doing series for Netflix and the global rights, and how values got put on global rights. There will now be values put on the flexibility of different windows for theatrical oriented content, and we'll move forward probably in a little less emotion than what happened at that time.
Mhm.
And anytime you go first, there are learnings, right? Anytime somebody decides to take a risk, there are things that don't go quite exactly as you expected them to go, but that shouldn't stop you from taking the risk, trying something different and sorting it out. And then others come behind it and learn from it and move forward.
Well, let's talk about the film that really sort of surprised and delighted so many of us, Zack Snyder's cut of Justice League, because that's one that you chose not to put into theaters, but keep exclusively for HBO Max. And, it was a huge moment for DC fans. And I think also for anyone who was just really starving for big spectacle. And I'm curious to know how that came about, where, at what point that seemed like it was a good business decision. Why now? I mean, to tell us a little bit about the conversation that went into making this happen.
Well, it would have been as it stood, and I think as you saw it executed, you can say what you want to say, but for most people, sitting in a theater for 3.5, 4 hours is a long time. And I think, I don't want to speak for Zack, but I think he wanted to tell the story in the way he wanted to tell it. And in some respects, I would say streaming opened up the option for something that may not have been as intuitive in a theater. And if he wanted to tell the story in the way he wanted to tell it, with the depth that he wanted to tell it, the notion that somebody could watch it in their home, maybe take a couple hours in, hit the pause button, go out and make themselves comfortable, fix a new bowl of popcorn, maybe refresh their drink, come back, or even possibly see the balance of it a little bit later or the next day. It opened up options like that made it probably more viable from a consumer viewership perspective. And, look, streaming and the dynamics around it opens up the value of what certain special event kind of content creates. And, when you start thinking about building to a moment that you can distribute into many, many households all at once, that has a certain type of commercial benefit and value that doing it in one other form, like putting it on a TV network at 8 o'clock at night, or putting it into a theater for a 1 month run or what have you, doesn't provide as much flexibility and opportunity to figure out how you monetize the investment. And so in this particular case, Zack wanted to finish the work. We were willing to invest in what he needed to do to finish and tell the rest of his story that he never got a chance to complete. And HBO Max was the right vehicle of which to do this. That's what afforded the opportunity for that to occur. And it's just, one of those time and place things. And I tend to believe, back to the adage of, a rising tide lifts all boats. Having more flexible platforms to do more things on will not only be good for theatrical, but it will be good for streaming as well, because there'll be some movies that, frankly, are going to get made now that will not get made for theaters, but they will get made for streaming, but they may work their way into theaters that make theatrical exhibition more viable to support things, because they can be monetized across broader platforms now. And I don't think that's all bad.
Right. Well, speaking of DC, I'm seeing a question from one of our cinematic arts minors. Michael Mooring, what went into the decision to move all DC properties over to HBO Max and to strip DC Universe Infinite of streaming? Any pivots planned for DCEU, the DC film universe?
So, I think the simplest way to think about this is streaming is a scaled business. And, my bet about where things go in the industry overall, and I'm sorry to talk about the business side of it, but there's probably going to be a handful of distribution platforms moving forward, and they are going to be global in nature. And they're going to have hundreds of millions of customers connected to them. And the notion of niche streaming, at least in terms of a standalone platform, I don't believe is really viable over the long haul. And you're seeing evidence of that. Think about if you want to go back and think about all the digital properties that were started for over-the-top news services and other special interest digital assets that are all really getting consolidated now into more scaled services like Vox or other capabilities. The reality is that this is a scaled environment. And so DC on its own, to be its own platform and its own service, it will struggle. And to have it as part of a larger family where we can afford to throw development dollars against more of the story vectors and have it more broadly distributed worldwide means it's going to be a richer universe than just strictly having it attached to people who are passionate enough about DC that they'll pay a standalone fee per month to do nothing but watch DC. There are maybe less passionate fans that would still pay something and be part of it that will actually broaden the amount of investment that's warranted in it and carry it further. And so it doesn't mean that DC can't live as its own brand and have its own subculture and have things that are special to it. We can't do things that cater to that fan audience like Fandom, which we do, that is kind of standalone and focused on that. But the platform and where it lives and kind of the home and where it resides probably needs to be something that's scaled. And when you have great intellectual property like the DC family or Harry Potter or any other long-standing intellectual property that you can extend, you're going to want to use that to help your scale development.
Well, speaking of long-scale development, I wanted to ask this question on behalf of JD Connor from our faculty. Under the Time Warner banner, HBO had a reputation for taking big risky bets. Exterminate All the Brutes, the Raoul Peck series, with its long production timeline, seems like the last new project left from that era. Do mega documentaries like that have a place on a service that needs to operate at scale? Could a project like that get nurtured there today?
I think the answer to that is yes. And, I'll tell you, if you just look at kind of where a lot of those decisions are being made within our company, I don't want to speak for others, but Casey Bloys is really the most senior individual making decisions on capital allocation for development, who is an individual that's been with HBO for many years and is responsible for greenlighting many of those riskier or more involved series during the course of his career. And, our point of view is our goal isn't necessarily to replicate Netflix. Our goal is to build a service that has its own character, and that character, I don't want this to come off negatively, but it's quality over quantity, that we in fact want to have a different character and take projects like that are a little bit riskier, maybe a little bit more brand cachet oriented, and have that be the characteristics of HBO Max or under the surviving HBO brand within HBO Max. Remember, HBO still sits within the HBO Max family. And so I don't think they're dead. I actually think they're very much a part of the brand character we want to build going forward, and still have many of the very same people around who are responsible for that work that aspire to do that kind of project. And frankly, for us to work with the creative community to be the first call of tolling for somebody to come in and say, I have one of those unique projects. Who do I want to speak to first about it? We want this to be viewed as a friendly and attractive home for people to come with that kind of work.
This question is from a current Cinema and Media Studies senior Aurelia Himawan, seeing as streaming and SVOD is predicted to ultimately result in a smaller profit pie than traditional cable or theatrical methods because of smaller margins. How is AT&T and WarnerMedia thinking about ways to increase those profit margins long term?
Yeah, I think that maybe that isn't exactly how I think about the business. I actually think about a couple of things that, it's a little bit of the quantity over quality, quantity dynamic. If you think about what I said earlier, if you made a piece of great content, you typically didn't own any of the distribution. So if you had a theatrical release and you distributed it overseas, or you distribute in the US, part of that money would go to the distributor. And it was a one-time visit. I actually believe over the long haul, a scaled subscription platform that has hundreds of millions of people involved in it can be at scale a more profitable and aggregate business model than the one that Hollywood was previously built on. But it will be scaled and there will be fewer distributors ultimately. And you don't get to this dynamic of it being as fragmented as it used to be. And the journey to get from where we have been to where we need to go is a bit of a high risk and painful journey. And during that period of time, the questioner is right. You're taking compressed margins or losses to get to the holy land of having direct access to hundreds of millions of customers every month who choose to pay you something every month. And that could be a much better place to be in its end state than where we were before.
Mm-hmm. This question is from Rachel Gandon-Mark. How do you see WarnerMedia's role in the explosion of local language television and film content around the world?
As I said, I would expect that any of these platforms that ultimately survive over the long haul are going to have to be global in nature. And by definition, if you're going to be global in nature, there will be an element of the content that's serviced in a particular market that is native and germane to that market and tuned to that market. So HBO Max and WarnerMedia, we already have, fairly sizable and meaningful production capabilities outside the US. They will only get more meaningful and more sizable. And, we clearly are doing planning today. For example, in Asia, Korea will become a hub for us doing Asian language content to service a variety of different markets in Asia. We are being very deliberate in Europe about where we're setting up our capability to scale further beyond what we already do in different parts of Western and Eastern Europe. So you'll see us actually tune more to markets, but I also believe, one of the benefits of these scaled platforms that are global in nature is we're all going to be seeing content that was native and developed for particular cultures and markets that will travel, that will now start to come into other markets where maybe before they would have stayed there and never seen the light of day outside of their home country or territory. And I actually believe that'll probably expose us to a much more diverse set of talent and creatives and stories and cultures. And, finding how you do that effectively without overwhelming an audience will be part of the trick of these distribution platforms moving forward. But I actually think in aggregate, that's going to be a positive thing for culture and for our society and for making the world a little less boundaryless than had it been otherwise.
I'm really excited to hear you say that because I particularly love watching international content, and the idea of that becoming more available directly through the service is great. I don't want to put you on the spot, but is there anything specific that you're looking forward to sharing through the platform that might be coming from a different market?
Oh, look, I won't get into too many specifics, but we've, one that I think I've talked about publicly, we have a co-production agreement that's fairly sizable we did with Sky in the UK as an example. And, we each bring different sensibilities to that relationship. And I think it ultimately is going to be one of those things where in a dominantly English-speaking market like the UK and the US, you're going to see a lot more content moving back and forth, and even more extreme, some of the things we're doing in Latin America right now. I will tell you that we'll move up into the domestic US market to service some of our Latinx communities in the US. Will be a big boon to HBO Max and that subscriber base that really is underserved today. And I think that'll be a big plus for them. And I could probably go on and on as it matures.
This question is from Mark Ahern's, an alum. Love the celebrity curated playlists on HBO Max, along with their video interviews explaining their picks. What would a John Stankey curated playlist look like?
Probably not one you're interested in watching. Oh, you know, it's interesting because I think I've said publicly as I came into this job, I was not a good time manager in terms of leaving a lot of time in my day to enjoy different aspects of media. And now it's literally part of the job. And I grew up in a Catholic household where watching TV was considered a sin. And, you know, my parents limited the number of hours that we got to watch at any given time. And I'm probably thankful that I learned how to read and study as a result of that. But now I'm having to get rid of the Catholic guilt. Anytime during the workday, I sit down to preview something or watch, you know, a particular piece of content that we generated. So I have some knowledge about it. I will tell you, I pretty much sample just about everything that comes out of every one of our creative channels. So my playlist tends to be geared toward finding enough hours to get through the 85 series, you know, a year that we produce out of the Warner Brothers studio, the 20 theatrical releases, the, you know, what I would call the 14 or 15 incredibly well scripted HBO dramatic or comedy series that come out. And that just consumes my time and is my playlist. What are some things that I've recently been through that I, you know, have recently enjoyed and watched? I highly recommend, if you're not watching Mayor of Easttown, I think Kate Winslet has done a remarkable job in it. I mean, I'm just so impressed with how she nailed the Philadelphia accent almost perfectly for a somebody raised in the UK. It's a lot of fun to watch. My wife and I, you know, we have just finished Fada, which, you know, we thoroughly enjoyed. It was a good show. I, believe it or not, got her to watch Westworld with me, which is one of my favorites, and have thoroughly enjoyed. I like the complexity of the story, but I'm not going to give you any great insights. I'm probably not deep enough.
Well, I have to agree. My wife and I are loving Mayor of Easttown. So everyone should watch it.
You know how it ends?
Sorry, don't spoil it. This question is also from an alum, Rich Cronin. With HBO Max as your priority, and with Netflix and Disney Plus and all the other streaming services growing, how will linear cable networks need to adapt from a programming and marketing standpoint to survive?
I think we're seeing, I don't know exactly how the traditional pay TV bundle will, you know, ultimately evolve, but I've been on the record as saying, you know, 500 channels is moving to 300 channels, is moving to 200 channels, is moving to 100 channels. And my guess is that, you know, linear construct continues to be relevant for a period of time for sports, news, and some reality-based programming that's more social in nature and event-oriented in nature. And the universe of programming that exists within that bundle is, you know, that's not as broad as it was, but most scripted is, you know, going to move to on demand because frankly, it's a better way for somebody to watch it, you know, watching it where they want to watch it, on what they want to watch it, at what time they want to watch it. And it's just a superior experience. And I don't expect that, you know, cable networks will be able to build a good enough product to stop that trend from happening. And so more scripted oriented content ultimately migrates its way into the SVOD world. And it means that the amount of programming investment that occurs in cable networks will tend to shrink on those types of content and probably continue to be relevant for things like sports news, and reality-based programming, but a much smaller number of channels or networks that are ultimately supported by that content.
Let's see. There's a question from Rex McGee, who is also an alum. I'm a cinema grad who wrote a Warner Brothers hit years ago called Pure Country for singer George Strait, which my songwriters and I transformed into a stage musical. We were to premiere last April in Houston's largest theater venue, but COVID shut us down on the first day of rehearsals indefinitely. Shortly after that, I learned that AT&T had cut Warner Brothers theater ventures to a skeleton service. Do you know when that division will be coming back to full power?
It'll be coming back when theaters reopen and we can move some of the content that we've produced for theatrical back into theaters. So it's just one of these things where we didn't have immediate product to put out, didn't have immediate work to do, and didn't have much in the funnel that we could push through. So the decision was to put it on hiatus for the near term.
Okay, this is from a current production and cinema and media studies student, David Agnew. With great franchises like the Mortal Kombat series and the Arkham Knight series of games, where do you see Warner Brothers Interactive Entertainment in the next 5 years? Any new IPs to be excited for?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. And without giving away too much, what I would tell you is I think our interactive development will lean much more heavily on the intellectual property that we own and operate, and maybe less on those that are tangential or not directly related. Some of the content that we can build into scripted or theatrical based storytelling. And look, I would expect that we should think about how we can do this differently. And our approach to that may be to be focused on taking that intellectual property and making it more community and social oriented and more experiential in nature. And if you can make it more community and social oriented, more experiential in nature, and bring some of that storytelling that we've traditionally done in scripted content into the gaming and interactive space, that's probably a more unique place that we can invest and set up our time and energy and extend some of those great, pieces of intellectual property that the questioner referenced, to get more out of them and have fans be more engaged with them in a way that's meaningful to them. So that's probably what you should expect coming out of Warner Brothers Interactive as we move forward.
This question is from Dan. Would WarnerMedia ever consider purchasing a theater chain like AMC or Regal?
It's been suggested, and we've asked ourselves the question whether we would be good stewards of operating theaters and creating unique and special experiences that are relevant for that space. And I think at least this individual's conclusion is our highest and best use of capital right now would be to get all the wonderful creative talent that we have surrounding WarnerMedia and make sure that it's fully developed. And when I'm looking for, the next incremental dollar to go to the next scripted project or the next piece of content development that we can then put out over scaled platforms like the direct to consumer, that feels like, from a shareholder perspective and a business model perspective, a higher and better use of our talents and time than us trying to go into the theatrical exhibition business against individuals who know that business very well, who have run it very effectively over time, and try to outthink them at creating a better theatrical environment. It doesn't feel like the right emphasis for our management team right now.
Continuing with exhibition for a second, there's a question from Christian Meoli, who runs the Arena Cine Lounge. Could you share your viewpoint on singular versus communal story experiences and giving your subscribers potentially the option of seeing stories together on bigger screens? Our theater receives many requests to screen episodic content weekly, but the content, plus the content is more epic and filmic and seems like a disservice not to screen it on larger screens.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. First of all, personally, I believe communal viewing is a big place, and I actually believe HBO Max and what we are working on from a product roadmap perspective should be something that facilitates that kind of an experience. But the point that is being made here is there that type of an experience that should be brought into a large screen format or environment? And, I know Rich Gelfond is, asking himself that question. And is there a way for him to start thinking about what is the next iteration of an IMAX theater, where he's invested heavily in unique formats and high quality experience? And now how does he do things that allows for a more rich communal experience with people going into a theater and doing something? And he has different ideas about it. I don't want to speak on his behalf, but it's not only in his mind the experience of watching the actual piece of creative content, but it might be what happens before and after, or what additional programming around that might be created that allows for interaction with people relevant to the creating of the content, those who acted or were part of it, the business model of bringing it in. I know he's doing a lot around that. And to my earlier point, my sense is if there's a new model to be created for communal experience in a theatrical environment, the owners of those assets are probably best positioned to think about that. But do I think there is a space for this kind of thing? Most certainly. And I especially think there's space in the digital environment for that to occur as we move forward.
That would certainly be exciting to me. Okay, this is from a production freshman, Sienna Tickle. With the ways in which the industry is changing, what skills will WarnerMedia be looking for in potential employees and interns in the next few years?
That's a really good question. Just as I started this conversation talking about what vertical integration is doing to change industries, I think it's really important for everybody to think about how vertical integration is changing everybody's job. And it's interesting that I talk about the three legs of the stool in a media business moving forward. And when I talk about that in a very simplified fashion, that creative has always been the cornerstone of every, good media company. And if you walked in, creative was king and it ruled the roost, and they're the highest profile individuals. But I think the media company of the next 10 years has a more balanced structure of power. Yes, creative still be incredibly important. That's where the product starts. But the revenge of the nerds, if you will, the technical folks who know how to do product, it can take end user requirements and turn it into software and build platforms with all the great capabilities that some of these questions went out, the co-viewing experience, how to bring in different features and functionality into that platform to enrich the content. And then those people who know how to do things like build the brands and the unique characteristics and the awareness where, that used to be sometimes a distributor's responsibility to do those things. All that is now coalescing together, and people who can work dynamically within teams, even at the front end of the creative being produced. How does the creative get done in the right way that allows for that golden thread to carry through theatrical, to scripted, to consumer products? Anybody who comes with that skill and that business savvy that allows for the three legs of the stool I just described to work effectively together, I think is going to, write their ticket moving forward. And so not being too pigeonholed, caring about those three legs of the stool, understanding how they play together, how you build alliances and relationships with them. I think that's a really important skill moving forward as you think about coming through your education, building your internships, and getting ready to go out in the professional world.
Well, I know that we have to let you go, but I just wanted to hit one really quick one from Dustin Jacobs. What do you think the Warner Brothers studio tour looks like post COVID-19?
It's just getting ready to get fired back up, and we managed to use this time quietly to finish some projects we wanted to do, and we re-engineered a whole bunch of it. And you're going to see actually a whole new look and feel when you come in to re-experience that. We've got a couple new venues set up, and I think it's a better experience. We managed to build some locations and pieces where somebody can work through the entire tour and in a select number of rooms and spaces that I think are more compelling. They have new audio visual complements to them. So I think it's actually a really good place to go, and we're really excited about opening it back up.
That sounds very exciting. Thank you so much. I'm just so grateful that you had the time to share all of this with us. And I know the dean is back as well to just send you a fun goodbye and thank you. So I'll let her take it away.
I appreciate you having me with you.
Well, John, it's been absolutely wonderful. And I look forward to the day when we can actually welcome you in person here to the school, which is very much a house that Warner Brothers helped to build. So we would love for you to see what the efforts of the company over these last 100 years have brought here. So we'll look forward to having you come and share some more of your views about the future of entertainment with us in person. In the meantime, all good wishes, and just looking forward to seeing the growth of the company.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. I appreciate it. I think we're all looking forward to that moment where we're back to doing this with a little bit of more human touch involved. So I'm looking forward to that. We'll see you.
All right, be well.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.